Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this fifth evidence session into our inquiry into child sexual exploitation following the J report on Rotherham. Say order, then we can start actually recording our proceedings. Before we begin, just want to ask members to put on record their interests they may have in this matter. I'm the Vice President of the Local Government Association. I also have a close friend, Councillor Charlotte Moyer Richards, who is a councillor in Sheffield, was for a time a part-time scrutiny officer in Rotherham Council.
I have two members of staff who are elected members on Derby City Council.
I also have two elected members working for me.
My wife is a councillor and members of my constituency staff are councillors.
Two members of my staff are local councillors.
Okay. Just to make it clear, what we said from the beginning of our sessions into this issue, what we've been trying to do is not necessarily look at the blame of an individual or individuals, but to look at the culture of the authority in Rotherham, which may have prevented it investigating and combating child sexual exploitation, about whether Rotherham is an outlier, is exceptional, or is representative of what could be a more endemic problem of child sexual exploitation across the country, and particularly today, both now and in our later session, the operation and impact of the Ofsted inspection regime and what that provided in terms of information when it was they conducted their inquiries during the period that we are looking at. So, to begin this evidence session, welcome, thank you very much for coming, Louise, today. Could I just ask for our records that you say who you are and the capacity in which you're coming before the committee?
My name's Louise Casey and I'm here as the inspector into the Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council inspection recently.
Okay, and thank you for coming so quickly after your report. I think you've probably had a chance to have a bit of a holiday between completing the report and coming to see us, but I'm sure that was well deserved after the lengthy period of inspection you undertook. When you were appointed to go into Rotherham as a Secretary of State's behalf to inspect what was happening there, I think the feeling may have been that you were going in there to an authority that had this very serious issues raised in the J report and was trying to put things right, was trying to move forward, and you were going there to assist in that process. But that's not how it turned out, is it? Your report says something rather different to that.
Yes, I think that, Chairman, would be accurate, that I didn't expect the local authority to be in quite such a state of denial about the problem. And actually, I also didn't expect the authority to be in quite such a difficult and frankly dire circumstances as it turned out to be. So yes, the inspection took a different route really. One, we had to assure ourselves that the evidence and information that we had was very thorough about what had happened over a long period of time. And two, we had to conduct a probably wider inspection than was possibly anticipated at the beginning. And I also was quite personally surprised of the level of sort of denial, really, of the problem in the ways that I outline in the report.
Yeah. So in essence, then, what you found in terms of the historical reasons for the problems with child sexual exploitation confirmed what Professor Jay had found, but then you went on to explain that you felt the authority hadn't learned the lessons and wasn't moving forward, which is slightly different to what Professor Jay indicated to us. And she was saying, the authority had got things really badly wrong, but was trying to move forward, and there were some signs of improvement. But you didn't find any signs of improvement at all?
No, I didn't find much light, actually, and I think that the authority at times sort of looks as if and might cling on to certain inspection reports or certain information. It does a lot of kind of commissioning external reports to come in and look at themselves. So at face value to think, this area is actually open to learning and open to change. Yet if you look right across the piece, it didn't change sufficiently. It did know that it had a problem of child sexual exploitation. It knew about it, and it didn't do a good enough job. In fact, if anything, what it did was close down the one bit of extraordinary good practice that Rotherham had above and beyond anybody else in the country, which was an outreach service to young victims of child sexual exploitation. So it was It was a much more difficult exercise than we anticipated in terms of hoping and anticipating that colleagues in the public sector would have been significantly more open to the fact that victims had not been treated well and continued not to be treated well. And I think we found that very concerning. And there are moments in the inspection report where if you look back over quite a long period of time, you can see at one point we put a chart together of all the different sort of inspections that had been done by Ofsted and their predecessors. And that essentially shows, in my mind, so clearly, really, on page 69, it sort of shows without a doubt that all of these issues have been raised over so many years, including with corporate governance inspections and all of the others, and yet not enough change happened on the back of that.
Right, but the here and now, one of the issues which you found, which Professor Jay highlighted, was a certain culture in the authority. I think, to shorthand version, sort of intimidatory leadership. Probably the former leader and deputy of the council were specifically mentioned. The former leader of the council didn't come to see you to have a conversation with you. But if they'd gone, didn't that ought to indicate that intimidatory style of leadership had changed and there was a chance to actually get the authority moving forward in the right direction?
No, if only this was about changing certain individuals. What we found in Rotherham, which we account for in the report, is an overwhelming culture and across a series of different factors. One, in my mind, you have, frankly, a local authority at points which is simply inept, and that, including during the era that Paul Lakekin was responsible for as the leader at that point, him and the collective leadership. That they made decisions and mistakes during that period, but if you look back across the whole 14-year period, the governance, the management of the local authority simply wasn't good enough. If you put that alongside a culture where there was bullying and sexist behaviour that intimidated people and got in the way, and then that alongside the race issue, which was an uncomfortable truth that nobody was prepared to talk about and deal with effectively and properly, that as a combination of factors is fairly unusual, I hope, in my mind, and I think that is where simply changing certain people would not have been sufficient. And I also think that the public in Rotherham probably have had enough, actually, of their local authority just not being able to grip this and manage it. And I think that the victims also in Rotherham have probably also more than had enough, in that what is needed in certain cases and certain times is a fresh start. The inspection report is significantly more damning than I anticipated when I set off to Rotherham, Chairman, but we did it thoroughly. We have more staff than somebody like Professor Jay did, and remember as well, we were operating this inquiry using inspection regime, so we could request any document, we could ask to see any member of staff. We were pretty thorough, and Professor Jay wasn't doing that. She was doing an inquiry in a different type of way. So ours is quite thorough in terms of looking at the local authority in terms of competence and culture. Right,
but I suppose taking away the democratic powers of councillors is one thing. Restoring them at some point, having an end to the process of commissioners is another. Have you got ideas about how that process should be worked through? We talked about a year, I think, as a possible time frame. When will you know it's right to actually hand democratic responsibility back to the elected representatives?
Well, I have offered to re-inspect the local authority should the next administration ask me to do that. But more importantly, I think that the Secretary of State has decided to put in quite a significant level of intervention and to appoint commissioners, where he clearly said in his statement to the House that from day one, those commissioners should be considering whether powers can be handed back to the executive. My own view is that for any area, but Rotherham is the one I have been closest to in the last 6 months, it is right that this is done properly but speedily. Not just about democratic control, my view is that this place needs to be fixed with quite a significant level of intervention that gets in and assists the staff in getting back on their feet, listens to victims properly, restores a sense of confidence in the local authority, particularly around child sexual exploitation, but more generally in children's services, and that actually I don't believe areas aren't fixable. And I would be disappointed if in 4 to 5 years' time from now, people were still having commissioners in Rotherham. I think my own view is that the area should be sought outable in a shorter period of time.
Right. And you see yourself going back and doing a re-inspection to see whether those conditions have been met?
Well, we have simply made the offer. It felt like the right thing to do, but there are other people that can check those things and do those things,
right.
Some that are probably better than me at doing it as well, so that's a matter for others to decide.
Just finally for me, the Secretary of State's actions in the end, based on your findings, were slightly different to the ones you recommended. I think you talked about commissioners monitoring what the council was doing, if necessary, intervening. Effectively, the Secretary of State decided to take over the executive authorities of the council completely through the commissioners. That's a fairly fundamental change, isn't it?
I think the intention is the same, and for me, the most important thing was that essentially I couldn't guarantee to him that every single bit of the local authority apart from it. So we didn't look at, for example, adult services to vulnerable people. So if you were in his shoes, you might be thinking, and this is what I think he was thinking because it was there in a meeting, that he wanted the security of handing out the executive powers would go to commissioners that then could check whether other services that we hadn't looked at in the same level of detail as, say, we did children's services, he would then have assurances that those were handed back, kind of having gone through a test of commissioners. I understand that. I understand that entirely, and I think in any case this is all a matter for him, actually, Chairman. My job was to write the inspection report and make my recommendation. In a way, it's up to him what he does, but I do understand the logic of where he has gone with it and what he's decided to do.
So the logic is that different parts of the service provision in Rotherham could be handed back to the councillors and council officers in a phased basis.
Yes, indeed. I think that's the logic behind it all, and I would strongly support that. I mean, I found what I found in Rotherham. It is for others to check whether other things are in the same state.
Okay. David.
You've referred, Louise, to the uncomfortable truth, the race issue in Rotherham. Perhaps you could just comment on how you think that came about, but in particular, what should the authority have done about it, and what should they be doing about it in the future?
Yes, I think the starting point was probably incredibly well-meaning in that actually by talking about the Pakistani heritage community and a minority within it being perpetrators of child sexual exploitation, there was clearly a fear that that then would label that wider community and create community tensions. An extraordinary short-sighted approach to dealing with the problem, because look where they found themselves with the EDL marching through the town and setting up camp actually in the police headquarters grounds. So the issue here is, and of course the other issue is that this went on over quite a long period of time and became quite an embedded culture, and we found that same culture in the here and now. So I think the learning surely for all of us is we have to talk about things even if they're difficult, and it shouldn't be difficult to talk about a minority of perpetrators, whether they're Pakistani heritage or, you know, Irish people that arrived 30 years ago. You know, those things shouldn't be out of bounds in terms of a conversation, if you see what I mean, and they clearly were in Rotherham. And where that gets you is to a place where actually many people that we interviewed said, well, we wouldn't use taxis and we would ask our kids not to. Do you see what I mean? So there was this knowledge of it, but like, you know, to call it an elephant in the room just wouldn't be sufficient. I can't tell you. There's just extraordinary inability to frankly sometimes say the expression Pakistani heritage community or Asian out loud. And that does such a disservice both to that community and to probably the vast majority of people that drive taxis in Rotherham, who I'm sure don't do anything wrong at all. So I suppose I feel the inability to talk about it, told not to mention it, told to say it as something different, when actually the vast majority of frontline staff and others confirmed to us that the perpetrators and alleged perpetrators were from that community ended up in a situation which actually meant that perpetrators were not pursued, that the area, both police and local authority, did not do a good enough job. And it came out of this wrangling with themselves as to how to talk about it. Does that make sense? Sorry, I went on too long.
It does, but the surprising thing about it is that the people you describe, people who are working, who should have been protecting the children, you would expect would be the educated, intelligent, skilled, highly trained people, many of them, that they'd be more competent at dealing with this than taking a simplistic view that it's politically incorrect to talk about Pakistani heritage. What was it within the authority?
Well, there are a number
that suppressed people who also have the skills to deal competently with that just through their job training.
Well, there are a number of issues, I think, that we highlight in the report, that it's not one single issue. So I don't want to go into specific individuals, but clearly there were some people that were quite powerful within the local authority who people found difficult to stand up to. There were some individuals that used undue influence potentially in terms of how they conducted themselves. That sent a message out. You've got a broader culture of people not being able to challenge, not able to discuss, not able to scrutinise anyway. Layer into that the fact that you've got a race and ethnicity issue at play that nobody else wants to talk about. In my mind, I feel the leadership, the management and the culture is what is responsible in a situation like that, and it needs to step up.
How does that get created, though, Louise? That's the important question, isn't it? I mean, the people that you don't want to name, and I'm not asking you to name them, I guess, would include people from the Pakistani heritage. So, some of the councillors from Pakistani heritage.
Indeed, and I think
they will be the suppressors.
And I think, to bring it into a different way of trying to talk about it without naming individuals, is that it was obvious from the front page of the Times, a paper that they may not have liked or may have liked, I don't know, whichever way, it was a national newspaper, and as we chapter in here, it was clear that wasn't discussed in any cabinet meeting. It wasn't discussed sufficiently in a way in proper meetings that you would expect to happen. So in 2008, there was an operation which is called Operation Central that we talk about in here and we looked at in some detail. We then compared that with the later operation called Operation Tsar. In both those cases, it was Pakistani heritage community perpetrators and alleged perpetrators. That sort of thing, I think, is discussed, is talked about. At one point, towards the end of the inspection, it became clear that still, at the moment, the police and community child sexual exploitation team were not registering the ethnicity of the perpetrators. So, in a way, this thing becomes ingrained after a while, and I think that it just got extremely difficult for them to talk about. And the sad fact is that when you step back from all of this and you have done interviews, you've looked at children's care files, you've looked at Section 47 strategy meetings, you've looked at all of these things, and writ large in those documents and in those meetings is the issue of child sexual exploitation is happening. It's happening with large numbers of perpetrators talked about, many of them from the Pakistani heritage community, and we as a public sector in Rotherham didn't do enough about it.
One last point from me then. My original question to you was about what should we be seeing the local authority run by these commissioners for the foreseeable future. What action do they need to be taking to get the fundamental cultural change that's implicit in what you said?
Well, I mean, the starting point is to start to actually look at the information they've got and start talking about it, to do a different type of dialogue, say, for example, with licensed taxi drivers, to actually engage with the Pakistani heritage community in the widest form that it possibly can. I mean, there are other areas of the country that have dealt with really difficult issues, and it doesn't seem beyond the wit of other areas of the country to deal with some of these very difficult issues. And I think that Rotherham, under commissioners or under any other type of administration, needs to step into this space and not deny that it has a problem with child sexual exploitation, not deny that many of those perpetrators are going to be from the Asian or Pakistani heritage community. And, there are two big goals here, really. One is that we actually prosecute some of these perpetrators for the crimes that they have taken against these children over such a long period of time. And secondly, that victims and, frankly, the wider public in Rotherham don't have to feel the shame of living there because it's an area that tolerates this type of thing against their children. And I think that's the thing which, forgive me, Chairman, I'm going back to that. You asked me whether, any intervention that would give the public of Rotherham, that we met on a daily basis going about our inspection, and people would say to me, I just feel ashamed to live here. That's not right. Those people have done nothing wrong, and they don't deserve that in their town, really. And that's why I think the intervention, whether it's what I recommended or what the Secretary of State is now doing, has to be really powerful and has to make a difference in terms of real action in that town in a short period of time.
The committee is interested in understanding how we've got to where we are, and from then what recommendations we might make to prevent this kind of thing happening elsewhere. But there was a report, it was the J report, it was quite a substantial report, and one assumes that if the J report had been taken seriously by the council and the councillors, then perhaps your report wouldn't have needed to be necessary in the first place. So my question is, how did the councillors respond to the J report on receipt of it? And perhaps you might tell us how they should have responded.
Well, by the time we got there, which was only a few weeks probably after Professor J published her report, I was disappointed to find so many individuals that were already starting to say essentially a version of she didn't get the maths right, or it wasn't very well evidenced, or she didn't interview me, or she did interview me but she didn't get my job title right, through to the more worrying ends of, well, if there are 1,400 victims, where are all the perpetrators then? As in a doubt as to whether this had happened. And I think, though, if one looks at that response in the history of their responses, then it's not unusual. And I think I've never done an inspection of this kind before. I've never worked for an inspectorate. I found it quite interesting that the power of the inspection to require people to talk to you, to be honest and truthful, and to give you any documentation that you asked for, a very liberating and interesting use of the inspection power. Because essentially, as I think you're aware, it's quite an unusual set of things to be asked to look at by a Secretary of State, to look at political correctness, for example, and then taxes. So I think that we had a particular set of powers that Professor J didn't have at her disposal, a bigger team and those sorts of things. But the answer to your question is I think that extraordinary backdrop of an ability to ignore their own local strategic safeguarding chair had arrived in Rotherham, written actually a good readout of their own child sexual exploitation report, and to his unending credit said both to us and to a public forum in Rotherham that he was then ignored for a year. Do you see what I mean? So actually this again to me is a very interesting dynamic in an authority that just felt very closed, didn't feel it was very good at challenge, didn't feel it was very good at scrutiny. It had one single dominating political power for quite a long time, wasn't very open to debate, these sorts of things. That's my reading of what happened.
Right, but you've told us that you had greater powers, greater resources than Jay. Do you think there was an error then in the terms of reference of Jay? Do you think Jay should have, in the first instance, been the kind of report that you've since done, or do you think there wasn't enough evidence to do that at the time? Or?
Oh, not at all. I mean, I think that what Professor J did was extraordinary, and what she did was entirely and clearly get under the skin of what was happening in Rotherham, that she managed to surface the issue of child sexual exploitation in a way that, in my mind, nobody could possibly ignore in Rotherham or indeed nationally. It was a significant wake-up call, surely, for many, many areas of the country to think again. And I think she did a very thorough and good job. We were undertaking a statutory inspection of the authority, which is a very different process, which was actually looking at the sort of best value duty about continuous improvement and whether the authority would be able to do that.
All right, so to back to my previous point, which is that what should the councillors have done on receipt of the J report? What would you like to have seen when you arrived some weeks after its publication?
Well, it's very much the position that the chairman talked about at the beginning of this, which is an authority that had thought, yes, we have made some mistakes, yes, we haven't got this right at all, that there are victims, it doesn't really matter what the overall number is, but we're not going to quibble over it, that actually we are going to re-look at our service to victims of child sexual exploitation, and we're going to get our act together.
All right, but Professor J did seem to indicate that there was some evidence of the council starting to get its act together. You found otherwise. Why did you take a different view?
Well, for the reasons outlined in the report, we were incredibly thorough, and as you can see, we didn't find that they were ready to change as significantly as they should do. In the report at some stage, I talk about a meeting that happened mid-September, where I found it quite interesting, indeed worrying, that out of their top two concerns as a local authority, their first was budget, that's entirely understandable. Their second one was the J report, and not in relation to whether they were running a decent children's service and that children were protected in Rotherham, but that it was affecting the reputation of Rotherham. And that was September 2014. That's a full, 9 months after Professor J had been in the place. It's a full 12 months after the articles in 2013. And in my mind, that amongst many other bits of evidence that we compiled in this report showed that their history of not facing up to problems would be the same. And I was, potentially concerned that they would do the same with my own, if I'm honest. But
right. Anyway. And what was your view of the partnership board that was set up with the LGA that was set up in September? Did you think that was a cosmetic exercise? Do you think they were there to get under the skin of the problems and deal with them?
Well, I think that at the point that Professor J published and in the aftermath of that, the LEN leader was very open to people coming in and trying to help. Obviously, he wanted to work with the improvement board. But, I have to say to you that the idea that a group of people coming in once every few weeks and having a meeting and looking at things just isn't a match for the types of problems that are in Rotherham and were in Rotherham. So even an improvement board, which might actually be something that is helpful now when there's a set of commissioners in place, that again is a matter between the Local Government Association Rotherham and the Department of Communities and Local Government. It's a matter for them to resolve. But again, the idea that the improvement board was a match for 14 years worth of ineptitude, incompetence, denial, and denial around an issue that is about exploiting children. So, all the issues that we in public life think that we hold dear, it is the protection of the most vulnerable. So if an area can walk away from the protection of the most vulnerable, that in my mind needs a response on the scale that we talked about in the inspection. It needs a response that is significantly more than an improvement board.
Right. And in your answer to Mr Hayes, you spoke about some people having undue influence. Are you satisfied that those people who had undue influence are no longer in a position to exercise any influence?
I just have to check with the chairman what the terms of appearing before the select committee are, because my legal position is I have no protection unless I'm...
You're covered by privilege.
I'm covered by...
Yes.
The answer to that question is yes. Just ask me the question again, because I was starting to panic when I heard you say people.
You spoke about some people having undue influence. Have all those people that you identified as having undue influence, have they been removed from positions where they can continue to exercise influence?
Yes, they have.
So that the authority is in a better position now to move forward?
Yes, it is.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Good. That's one follow-up to that, actually. Yes, I understand the sensitivities.
No, that's all right.
Absolutely. Bearing in mind what you were saying about a phased transfer back to the authority and hopefully maybe a year before things go completely, depends on how they proceed. Despite the problems you found there, were there any glimmers of light around, basis on which the authority could move forward? Were there some individuals who were getting it, were recognising it and wanted to do the right thing?
we found, and this is why we wrote it at the very beginning of the report, that there were many people in Rotherham, particularly at less senior levels, that really just wanted to turn in a good day's job and didn't want to be working in an environment where this was happening on a day-to-day basis, that the sort of lack of leadership and overall management was something that, they talk about looking up and thinking, where is everybody, if you see what I mean, where's the leadership? And I do feel there's an awful lot of decent, good people that work in Rotherham that, again, are brought into disrepute by this. And that's what makes it so difficult, I think, that you can't let that happen. Most people who work in Rotherham, I'm sure, do not set about to not protect children. But that happened in Rotherham and continued to happen for far too long. So, yes, there are. And also, there are people that used to work in things like risky business who continue to go above and beyond what they are supposed to be doing, really, to help historic victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation. So I think that's and always one of the worries about these sorts of scenarios is that what happens is, people come in at the top, they stay for a bit, and then they go again. And what Rotherham needs is a consistent approach from decent, good people to lead them out of this. And I'm not suggesting it needs to take forever, but some of those staff need to be listened to. Some of the solutions to what's happening in Rotherham lie in the hands of victims because they have very clear views on what type of support that they want. It lies in some people that used to work there that don't anymore, who are able to support those victims, and it lies in some of the frontline staff that we met.
Any of the councillors?
Yes, there are. I mean, I didn't go in to test the councillors, as it were. I looked at the collective outcome, but I'm sure that there are some councillors in Rotherham, in currently the party that's in power, that can do a very good job. Yes.
Okay. So.
Thank you, Chairman. Louise, your report says we've concluded that whilst the council has followed its own procedures, these have not always ensured that it has taken and continues to take appropriate action against staff potentially guilty of gross misconduct. Your report then goes on to say no one has been held to account for the serious failures Professor J identified. Senior officers within Rotherham, what should be done with them?
Quite a number, Mr. Chair, have now left and gone. So in a way, that's a matter for others. I suppose in terms of what we found, we weren't tasked with investigating disciplinary issues according to staff over what turned into a 14-year period to look at. We did look at their HR processes, and as you say, we found them failing in terms of, or not fit for purpose, or whatever expression we used at that point. Where we did find evidence of senior culpability, we did name those senior councillors and we identified those staff in the report, whether they work there now or not, and they are identifiable in the report. And obviously the other thing is that I've been very clear, and it's very good to be able to say this, that I think the Local Government Association are actually on trying to work out, they're very supportive, as am I, to the kind of review of social workers in the area, which in fairness commenced before we arrived. The local authority did that. The second thing is I think that all staff that used to work in Rotherham that are now working in other local authorities or public services around the country, their own employers need to take a look at those individuals and satisfy themselves that that they should be doing what they're doing, and I know a number of local authorities are doing that. So in a way, our job was to establish, was this place fit for purpose in terms of HR? The answer to that question is no. It becomes a matter for others in some ways to hold their own individuals that are still employing them to account.
I think it's good that your report has named those individuals, but do you think that there needs to be some sort of change in terms of how, particularly where an senior officer has left the authority or even retired, whether there needs to be some sort of change, whether it's in legislation or in some other way that can deal with people who've really failed, residents in this way?
I mean, I think that it's. I could say this is a matter for others, but I'll give you my view that. I think where you're within one of the professions like social work, obviously there are different professional standards. I think what's interesting about Rotherham is that it shows that if you don't sit in one of those professions where you have your conduct is externally monitored, as it were, then essentially, yes, you can move elsewhere. I personally think that's an issue that the Local Government Association and others, government as well, should look at, because essentially what you potentially have is a movement of individuals that have got compromise agreements who then move on, and actually nobody looks back. So part of the problem in some of these circumstances is, I mean, anybody that's worked in Rotherham in a way, everybody will look at now. That's how it's going to be. Unfortunately, for many decent, hard-working, highly competent people in Rotherham, that they are also caught up in this. I think that you're right to say perhaps there's something that people should look at. I think particularly, Mr. Janczak, for senior people. I think senior people, in a way, we're paid well. You have to take some responsibility that goes alongside with that. And the kind of compromise agreement culture doesn't help with that.
Okay. Let me turn to Risky Business. This is quite innovative, dynamic project that early on was really advocating for the victims of this abuse, were championing their cause, was trying to get their concerns and the abuse that they were receiving on the agenda within the local authority. That gets subsumed into the council's department and really dissolved, really, it's effectively closed down. Do you think that was done deliberately?
Do I think that the professional jealousy of Risky Business was a professional jealousy that was deliberate and present? Yes, I do. Do I think that contributed to the closure of Risky Business? Yes, I do. Do I think that was a huge mistake? Undoubtedly. I think that it happened over a long period of time. To say it was subsumed into Children's Services Central just isn't an accurate reflection of the circumstances. That essentially, as it subsumed, it lost most of its staff, and that despite the fact that the youth service within Children's Services have continued and continue to offer some form of outreach, it was nowhere near what Risky Business was doing when it was at its best. I think that what happened, and this is troubling really over a long period of time, is that people in an organisation, it wasn't just Risky Business. When Risky Business was set up, there was a like-minded group of individuals that went beyond just some of the sort of people I know that you've spoken to, and all of those individuals wanted to do a lot to tackle this problem, from managers that were running the children's homes that knew that taxi drivers were coming to their doors and taking the girls away and knew it wasn't good. There was a lot of people that wanted to do something about it. And I think the sadness for me is that over such a long period of time, they weren't listened to, they weren't taken seriously, and the sort of giant of child protection, really, which is not the type of approach that will necessarily work. So as I put in my report, that yes, this was a minority at that point of the caseload of children's services overall, but my God, what a dreadful set of circumstances those adolescent and teenage girls were living in, and that they were actually girls that were in the protection of the local authority. Because the children's services social care model is essentially constructed and built around interfamiliar abuse to do with essentially younger children in families, the idea then that they couldn't get their heads round, really, if I'm being gentle about it, or decided not to, meant that these girls, and some of the victims talked about knowing full well that they were waiting till they turned 16 or 18 and then they could be struck off. The girls knew that both the police and others wrote them off as slags, as runaways, as troublemakers. And I've no doubt, and some of them have said to me, how difficult they would have been when they were that age. But that's not, our job is to do a better job in those circumstances than was done to those girls, really. So I think it's a combination of things, of professional jealousy, of this kind of giant of children's services, that even if it was well-meaning, the idea you could put a 13, 14-year-old that's come from a terrible background, who's been sexually abused and physically abused by her own family, is then taken into care, has gone through foster care after foster care, and it's broken down, ends up in a children's home, and she's groomed by a very sophisticated, nasty piece of work that knows to hand over the phone, to hand over the money, to hand over this, to hand over that, and to pull her into his world of abuse and nastiness. The idea that we deal with that with a 35-day assessment or a referral process or a parenting course, it just doesn't work. And the sad fact is, at points, Rotherham were ahead of the game with their risky business model. You know, that they possibly were doing things that some other colleagues around the country weren't doing. And then I think it is a tragedy that they then did not have the bravery and courage to continue with that project.
We can have you, and we can have Professor J, we can have professional reviews of how all that worked. But do the police need to look at the failures within that department?
The police, South Yorkshire Police more generally, need to look at the failure to the victims in Rotherham, full stop. The interesting thing about Rotherham Borough Council is they had no choice but to be inspected. They have to pay for their own inspection. Every member of staff that we asked to see had to see us, or else we would infer something negative from that. Yeah. We could look at any document we want to look at. We left no stone unturned. We took much longer than I know colleagues wanted us to do, because we wanted to be utterly thorough. In my view, that same scrutiny has not happened to South Yorkshire Police.
I suppose I'm saying, sorry, I think I phrased the question badly, but do the police need to investigate whether there was any culpability in terms of the officers within the department failing the victims?
Forgive me, I think that I understand that South Yorkshire Police are, I think it's a matter of public record, have referred some individuals over this period to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. I think they have done.
Okay. And then my final question really is...
Sorry to interrupt. My point is that's too easy a solution for those victims. I'm sorry, I should probably speaking right outside my brief to you, but the police have to step up and accept the same level of responsibility to those victims and those perpetrators as the local authority. And we were asked to inspect Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council, and we've left no stone unturned. It's a pretty thorough and damning report. The same level of scrutiny has not happened to what happened to the police in Rotherham over that time period.
Okay. And that needs to happen?
In my view, it should happen, yes.
Okay. And just my final question really about missing documents. You talk in your report the critical work they undertook, risky business, is now missing from Rotherham MBC. There's also suggestions that taxi operators' manual files have been missing, and some children's case files are missing. Is it possible that there are missing documents which could have helped prosecute cases against the rapists of children?
That's very hard to judge, actually, and I'm absolutely direct and with you about it, that what I do know is that the papers that I know you asked Rotherham Borough Council to produce were produced. They're not perfect, so the key players' minutes, which Professor J wasn't given, they certainly gave what they had of those to us. There's about 15 sets of those minutes. We also know that over time periods, as I put in my report, there are discussions about files going missing. We definitely established that, having looked at that information and other information that was supposedly missing from risky business but was found in the first floor of Riverside House, a lot of it was anyway, that the sort of idea that people didn't know what was happening wasn't true. So I think for some people that have appeared before you and others, that these missing papers from 1999 and 2003 are really a validation that they attended meetings, that they were minuted, and that the police were there, health was there, social care was there, and not enough was done by the girls. As to whether there is perpetrator information missing from this period, I would find that really hard to judge, actually, and think that there are people that are worried that that is the case. And I can't answer that question in all honesty. I don't know what the answer is. What I do know is that South Yorkshire Police have with the National Crime Agency, I am hopeful that they will grip the perpetrator information, and not just one or two, but the lot of them, and at least try and audit whether anything can come of the information that they already hold. But again, as I put in the report, we are concerned about the victim care to young women in the main who will be subject of those sorts of, who will be called forward and asked to be witnesses in those cases, and I am concerned about how they are being helped in that process. So even if the police got their head around the files and all the rest of it, the other part of that has to be how you're helping these women, because they're women now.
There's not much evidence of any of that happening, is there, President?
There hasn't been. There hasn't been at all, but I understand that in the current set of papers that are on the Cabinet meeting for Rotherham in relation to their budget, they have now put a further amount of money into trying to establish a service that will be for the historic victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation, which is a great and good thing if they get that right.
Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to move on to scrutiny and whistleblowing arrangements. And obviously scrutiny can be an incredibly important and powerful tool when it's used appropriately. But I just wonder whether you could give us your thoughts on why you think that the scrutiny function in Rotherham failed so badly.
I think that I thought as a select committee you might ask me about this. So I think the scrutiny question is quite interesting because it is really the overall failure in terms of challenge. So what you have is a local authority with a very dominant single party over a long period of time, which of course can be a really helpful thing in certain circumstances, getting things done, but where no challenge was there. Certainly a very weak opposition that doesn't appear to do much challenging or scrutinising over this time period. And so there's that. There's then the culture of some bullying, sexist and intimidating behaviour, which of course makes challenge much more difficult. From individuals that I have named in the report, but it's a cultural issue. It's not just the former leader. It was something that came up repeatedly. But it's elected members rather than staff. It's both. There were staff that also behaved in a way which reinforced that culture, which I think we mention a couple of the examples in the report. So if you've got very close sort of political dominant structure, very weak or non-existent opposition, or incompetent weak opposition. Alongside that, you've got a kind of overwhelming culture and actually one of the most difficult issues was never talked about, which was race and ethnicity in relation to child sexual exploitation. And then on top of that, of course, they laid their scrutiny function low. So the scrutiny officers that we met, we thought they were pretty decent people trying to do a good job, actually. But if you have a leader that says nothing's going to scrutiny unless it comes by me for 5 months, or you have scrutiny is actually resourced by the other directors, so the only way that something goes on a scrutiny committee is because the head of this or the head of that says, yes, that's fine, I'll resource looking into that, then it's a very weak function. But I think to see it just as a scrutiny function within the local authority, to see that has to be seen within that wider culture.
Would you think, or would you suggest then, that the lack of resources were made available for scrutiny, and is that a real problem?
Well, I mean,
was kind of seen as a lower priority within the overall scheme of model?
More than lower priority. I don't think people particularly wanted to listen to anything that was bad news. That it's a kind of, that's what I'm saying, the culture of actually speaking out, and so even though I'm sure the people there will always argue for more resources, I don't personally necessarily think this is a straightforward issue of, if only we had more staff in scrutiny. Because actually, if no matter how many staff you've got in scrutiny, if the leadership and the executive management say, we'll decide what comes to scrutiny, we'll decide how it comes to scrutiny and how it's discussed, then it isn't really open to scrutiny. It's not scrutinising, is it? No. That's a different process, really.
But I mean, scrutiny, though, if it's used effectively, can scrutinise outside of the local authorities' own boundaries, as it were, and look at other agencies. And other agencies obviously had a role in this whole agenda. And I wonder whether you've got any comments about lack of resources, or whether resources had anything to do with why scrutiny wasn't sort of not only scrutinising effectively internally, but also the other agencies' involvement or lack of it.
I mean, in fairness, we saw on the health scrutiny side that it seemed to be that seemed to be quite an effective way of doing it, but more profoundly, the sort of scrutiny of partners. I mean, who was scrutinising that the police did nothing enough? Not enough, they did something, but certainly not enough for 14 years. Who was scrutinising holding the police to account?
Would you suggest that the scrutiny committee there ought to be doing that? That ought to be something they ought to be looking at and calling the police to account?
Well, I think that a number of... I think the Cabinet should probably be asking the police what they're doing, and the police should be asking the local authority what they're doing. I mean, clearly there needs to be a greater sense of robust discussion between those two bodies.
But scrutiny is the function, isn't it, really, for that? I mean, formally, we could call witnesses and so on. They may have these kind of conversations with the Cabinet, peer-to-peer in that sense. But in terms of bringing people before in public, as it were, and scrutinising, I mean, would you suggest that ought to be a role that is fulfilled by the scrutiny committee in this particular circumstance, in other local authorities for that matter?
Yes, I'm sure it would help. I think that part of the issue in Rotherham is there wasn't enough debate, enough challenge and enough discussion, both within partnerships but more broadly, and scrutiny obviously plays an important part in that. Their team was under-resourced in terms of other experiences around the country. I'm just saying that it needs to be a more powerful... Where if the opposition is so small or so weak, then actually scrutiny has to be a more important function in those sorts of circumstances, and people need to embrace it slightly more. But it wasn't particularly welcome in Rotherham in the way that we talk about in the inspection report.
So do you think then, I mean, you touched on this a little bit, but in circumstances like in Rotherham, where it's dominated by one political party, and I mean this applies in other local authorities, different political persuasions where there is one party is dominant, do you think that then inevitably means that scrutiny is impaired as a consequence?
No, it doesn't have to be, does it? I mean, not at all. The issue is that it was in Rotherham.
So you don't think the fact that it was dominated by one political party necessarily was the issue then?
I think it's a number, as I've outlined, I think it's one of the circumstances that it was at play in Rotherham, which is it had one dominant political party, one dominant leader. It wasn't open to scrutiny. It had a weak opposition. And alongside the factors that of kind of this intimidating type of atmosphere that officers were, and some officers were both intimidating and operating in that environment, that's a recipe that doesn't make challenge and discussion about difficult issues very easy. And I think that scrutiny can play a really important part in terms of, in a way, scrutiny can be absolutely part of the solution to discussing these sorts of difficult things, and should have been in Rotherham and probably should be in other local authorities around the country.
I just want to move on to whistleblowing. I mean, could I just ask this then? I mean, is it the calibre then of the councillors sitting on the scrutiny committee and undertaking that scrutiny function in Rotherham, or is it the culture of the organisation that is the main problem? Which of those or both is it, do you think?
We didn't go into that in the inspection report in terms of the calibre of the people on scrutiny, so I think it would probably be wrong for me to talk about that now, but I think I do say I definitely say that the calibre and capability of councillors was very mixed, and that obviously when you have people in both cabinet positions or key roles like chairs of scrutiny, then they have to be very good at what they're doing and very skilled, particularly in an environment where you're standing up against a big majority that may not want to listen to you. So yes, of course, calibre calibre is always important in any job, in any walk of life. I just think that in relation to the scrutiny issue in Rotherham, that whether it was better resourced or less resourced, better chaired or better not chaired, it wasn't a welcome part of what the local authority leadership, both management and members, wanted to hear.
Do you think there's an issue about the status of the scrutiny function, just in terms of elected members get onto an authority, if they're aspiring to make a big impact, the tendency, is it not, is to seek a position in the cabinet and to take on a portfolio rather than necessarily going down the scrutiny function. Have you any evidence of that? Do you think that's an issue? I mean, will that come into the kind of cultural...
I couldn't comment beyond Rotherham, if I'm absolutely honest with you. I think it would be unfair for me to because it draws a sort of wider policy conversation, which is probably not right for me to comment on.
Okay, if I can move on then to whistleblower, because obviously the whistleblowing policies were in place in Rotherham. Why do you think they failed?
For all of the reasons that we've talked about, which is this place was not kind on people that spoke difference. And if you think about one of the most extraordinary things is that in these meetings about child sexual exploitation, attended by the police, by people in children's social care, by Risky Business and others, essentially they were blowing a whistle but without a capital W, and they were ignored and then closed down. And as I put in the report about whistleblowers more generally, that when they came forward to talk to us, many of them said, I'd never do that again. It was the worst experience of my life. People got very upset. They felt that they were punished very harshly for being whistleblowers. And again, it's hard to, I must sound like a terribly boring broken record, but in an area where they had these 3 or 4 big issues, this kind of ineptitude and incompetence, this dominance, really, a sense of not being prepared to talk about, frankly, something everybody should have been talked about, which is child sexual abuse of their children and exploitation of their children, in many cases by alleged perpetrators that were from the Pakistani heritage community, alongside a situation of intimidating, bullying and sexist behaviour. That's not exactly a place that's very easy for a whistleblower to come out into. And then, of course, as you see in the report, we talk about a couple of the cases where, it wasn't an easy experience from them. So despite the fact they had procedures in place, and again, this is something which is interesting in relation to the inspection overall, is we felt quite a lot of their procedures were strong. They had a small but good team in scrutiny, and they had good procedures. It just, that won't shift it, will it, if the overriding culture is something that doesn't...
In terms of then, finally, a recommendation from this committee then, what do you think we should be recommending to make whistleblowing more effective? What could be done? What ought to be recommended, do you think?
Well, I suppose if if you were a chief executive of any local authority right now, I think I would want to do what we did, which is review the last load of whistleblowers and what happened to them, and possibly even go and see some and see what that experience was like. In all of these things, we can have the best procedures in the world. The issue is what is actually happening to the person on the receiving end of those procedures. And at the end of the day, the only way to test that is to listen to somebody that's gone through that experience. A bit as the same would be, in my view, that if people wanted to, you asked me, I think, what should now be done in relation to victims. Somebody needs, other than me, at a senior level in Rotherham, to go and listen to the experience of those victims and listen hard, so that any service that is set up actually meets their needs and isn't just a procedure and a strategy that's also being ticked off. And I think I would say the same thing about the whole coming forward and whistleblowing.
Okay, well, thanks.
Simon.
Thanks, Jim. In answer to our question, had Ofsted failed the children of Rotherham, Professor Jay said to some extent yes. What's your assessment, Louise, of the performance of Ofsted at Rotherham?
Well, I think all inspection has essentially failed the children of Rotherham in relation to child sexual exploitation. I would include Ofsted in that, in a nutshell. I mean, I think that I noticed that you have been taking evidence from people that have worked in Ofsted, and I was quite struck by that. I suppose for me, it's really important that the local authority, the police and others in Rotherham must take primary responsibility above and beyond all others for letting those children down over that sustained period of time. It's Rotherham that are to blame for that. And Ofsted, as I've put in that chart, repeatedly told them about weaknesses and failings that they didn't listen to. But if I was in Ofsted's shoes when I read that report, I'd be thinking, don't think we that wasn't our finest hour, and don't think we did a good enough job.
And what about the LGA's idea that we should have more joined-up inspections rather than just relying on individual ones?
Yes. Is that their idea? Well, I, of course, have a slight fear of something called a joined-up inspection, because potentially what it means is that you just have a collection of people with their own structures that they want to look at in their own time frames, in their own language. So you might have an HMIC that's looking at one thing, the constabulary one. You'd have the people from the youth offending world looking at their thing, using their essentially structures and language. You'd have somebody else coming from Ofsted that's looking at their stuff. And the person on the receiving end is now not just managing an Ofsted inspection every so often, and the resources we now spend on managing those are something to be considered. But actually what you do is you're on the receiving end of multiple different inspections, all of whom are looking at their own structures, their own systems. Do I think that one of the interesting learnings out of this is if you want to get under the skin of something and you want to look at an issue in an area, then sometimes what it might be useful to do is send in a group of people that aren't straight-jacketed by their system, as it were, and that you stand back and use the inspection powers to investigate and try and get under the skin of something, hopefully in the way that we tried to do here. If that is what a multiple inspection turns into, that's fine. But I do worry about kind of then all you do is have 5 different bureaucracies looking at something bureaucratically rather than trying to get under the skin of something.
And so what you're saying is that Ofsted could certainly learn from the way that you've done the inspection? Well,
Ofsted check structure. You have to ask yourself, what do you want Ofsted to do, I suppose, and what we, the government needs to work that one out. And
just sorry to cut across you there, Louise. What the public want Ofsted to do is the public want to rely on Ofsted to go in and observe what's going on in the authority and reach the conclusion and tell them whether the authority is doing a proper and right job or not. And in various occasions in Rotherham, they kept telling them they were doing all right, and you didn't have what to worry about.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously we've reached obsessive levels with this type of stuff in the inspection team. At points, Rotherham was given some glimmers of hope. One was a paper-based exercise, which wasn't probably the type of inspection that is certainly done now. So their inspection frameworks, I think they call it, develop over a period of time, and they've got more sophisticated or they've changed. I think Rotherham would cling on to anything that was dangled before them as good news. And I do think that the kind of... I'm not letting Ofsted off the hook, incidentally. I need to be absolutely clear that I don't think they're necessarily always got it 100% right, but you can't get over the fact that they repeatedly found weaknesses. And I think we have this culture, don't we now, which is you're as good as the last inspection. And so if that's the culture, then you're not going to look back. We had the privilege, really, of being able to look back over a very long period of time and look at inspection reports not just done by Ofsted, but by their predecessors. We looked at audit, we looked at everything, at corporate governance reviews and all of the lot, and actually Rotherham bucked all of them. So, of course, one needs to then scrutinise the inspectors, but inspections do a point in time look at an area, they write a report and they send it in. For me, I think that inspection needs to be kept separate to improvement. I personally think that, I know because you've asked about that of other people, so I thought I'd mention it, take the floor, that essentially I think that if the same group of people that are responsible for inspecting are also then essentially tied in with improvement, then it doesn't feel to the public, and certainly to me, as that's a clean enough scenario. But anyway, that's just my view. It's not necessarily something I should necessarily have a view on.
Okay, thank you.
I just wonder if I might push you on the matter of resources that the council allocated to children's services. I mean, particularly in recent years, we've seen local authorities come under pressure on funding, and it might be a very easy conclusion to draw that there were problems in children's services. That was because they weren't given enough money. What's your assessment of that?
I mean, again, if only it was a single individual or about money, then this would be an easy thing to solve, and that simply wasn't what we found. Rotherham didn't do a good enough job in relation to this over a very long period of time, including when people would describe it as having significantly more money. Over a long period of time, including from 2007 onwards, you see a decline in children's services, and actually at points you saw a greater investment in children's services that wasn't mirrored in then significant improvements. So, of course, one is always concerned about money and resources, particularly in the age of austerity, which is where we find ourselves now. But Rotherham wasn't found failing because of money. It was found failing because it let children down.
Right. And in 2014-15, the council did find some additional funds for children's services. Were they spent wisely, or was that money simply wasted?
Well, as you can see in the report, that we also double-checked so Malcolm Newsom, the Children's Commissioner, double-checked the Ofsted inspection in October, November, and we ourselves followed it up to just be absolutely sure that they were right. And as we were there, during the course of that inspection, their front door, i.e. the way that children start the process of getting help, was not safe. So I don't think it's an issue of money, it's an issue of competence and culture within the local authority.
Right, and if additional funds were to be made available to an authority facing problems such as Rotherham, how do you think they could be spent? What additional expenditure could help solve some of the problems that Rotherham faced?
Well, somebody's going to have to pick up the bill for the commissioners for my inspection, and probably a number of other things, which I'm sure won't be easy for them. But the starting point, that
money won't be spent for the benefit of the victims. I mean,
that's my point.
Yes,
my point is the starting point has to be making children's services safe and reaching out to victims, going and finding victims, not just hoping that they knock the door, but people that we know have been sexually exploited by these perpetrators over the last 15 years. Their lives are devastated and destroyed, and Rotherham needs to spend any money it does have on getting that right and getting it right now.
But more staff, nicer, grander buildings, more events for young people to get involved in, would they help?
No, not necessarily. Grander buildings.
Not grander buildings for children's homes, for just
sorry,
additional resources. I'm not thinking about nicer buildings, but more resources and more facilities.
Potentially, but I think what it needs fundamentally is an approach, a service that will reach out to these girls on their terms. They closed it down. They need to reopen it. And on top of that, they then need to reach out to the historic victims, who will need things like family therapy, who will need support if ever they're going near a courtroom. Getting them into that courtroom and getting them through that is going to be no mean feat at all. Who now, some of them have brought children into the world themselves and are struggling as parents because they started out awfully young because of the type of abuse that they experienced. They're the sorts of things which we know how to do and we know how to get right. And I know that Rotherham now, in fairness to them, are considering those issues and wanting to get that right. And for me, that's the starting point.
Thank you.
I think you said to me earlier, Louise, that you knew that other authorities had got this right, that there were good exemplars. Do I take it from that you did actually do some comparative work?
Sorry, forgive me.
Do I take it from the comment you made earlier, you did some comparative work to look at what happened in other local authorities?
In relation to child sexual exploitation, we have obviously, because of the profile of the inspection, come across some other areas, and that's the subject of my next report.
Right. Okay.
Is to look at how we can take a determined approach to how we tackle child sexual exploitation, perhaps to learn from areas like Rochdale that certainly have talked about getting it significantly better, to learn from possibly Oxfordshire and Derbyshire and some of the others, and say, okay, we know bad things happened, let's now look at what are the sorts of things that you would have in place. I mean, again, sorry to harp on about this, but one of the reasons we put an appendices right at the back called Tools and Powers to tackle child sexual exploitation is because we were very struck that Rotherham didn't seem familiar with any of these powers and didn't seem to use them in relation to child sexual exploitation. And they are sitting there ready for people to use, to tackle, to change, to stop perpetrators of child sexual exploitation. So, I accept entirely that tackling child sexual exploitation is a really, really difficult issue, and I don't think I've said that, actually, which I should have done, both in Rotherham and nationally. I don't underestimate how difficult it is at all. It's a really difficult thing to grip and to stop and to then prosecute. I just feel that Rotherham didn't try hard enough.
Is it too early then to ask you if you've been able to form a judgment about whether Rotherham is an extreme outlier, or we can perhaps expect similar problems in other local authorities?
God, that's a hard question. I mean, I have worked, I hope as colleagues know, I've worked very closely with local government over a long period of time now, and I have to say that the sort of culture, that combination of sort of not facing up to uncomfortable truths, sexist, bullying, intimidating behaviour, frankly ignoring what was being discussed in those meetings around violence, rape and abuse of children, it doesn't feel a familiar place for me in local government. I don't feel that that's typical of local government at all. I really don't. I think there was an unusual set of factors at Rotherham. Can I sit before this committee and tell you that Rotherham is the only place? No, I can't, because I'm not inspected anywhere else. Do I think the issue of child sexual exploitation is not being dealt with effectively? I think that most colleagues in local government, certainly, and colleagues across the divide, actually, are all now considering as to whether we're all doing a good enough job on child sexual exploitation, and the answer at the moment is no, we're probably not. And I don't think that's a political statement. I think everybody would agree that we're not getting it right around child sexual exploitation. I think for me, we just need to learn from some of the areas that have obviously hit national profile, but actually have now tried to re-gear their services and get something very practical and simple and straightforward out to people to say, 10 things to look at would look like this, and I feel that we need to get on with that and get that out to help colleagues out there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just a couple of final points. So, as of today, who's responsible for this? As of today, we sit here. Who is responsible for grappling with these issues now in Rotherham?
I believe, and you're probably more expert in the world of interventions than I am, that until the commissioners are appointed and commence, the leadership of Rotherham is still in charge. But right. You'd have to ask somebody better than me.
Well, that's the Secretary of State tomorrow then, when we see.
You can ask the Secretary of State tomorrow.
Okay, and two other points. You mentioned the need for...
So on that, the interim chief executive of Rotherham, Jan Almondroyd, is excellent, and throughout this process has actually tried to support both the politicians and getting things done. So obviously she's not politically in charge by a long chalk, and the 4 of the existing cabinet members who had nothing to do, in their view, with the previous issues have stayed helping with this transition process, and my understanding is they will stand down. So the 4 that were involved, as it were, with more of the history, have gone completely. 4 have remained that weren't sort of in the middle of it all, and they've been working really hard to then try and welcome and make sense of the commissioner process when it kicks off. And I think the Secretary of State is really keen, as far as I understand, to get these commissioners appointed and into Rotherham as quickly as possible, which would be a very good thing, at which point my understanding is those 4 cabinet members will stand down and the new leadership will take over.
Right. Just to pick up a couple of points, you mentioned the probably need for an inspection of the police. I suppose for people in Rotherham, going through the trauma, so many people looking at this, what's happening in the town where they live. They had the J report, which shocked them. They've now had your report, which has probably shocked them again. They're probably less surprised than they were when they got the J report. They've had, probably noted some select committee hearings going on. What they haven't seen is anyone actually held to account for this. None of the perpetrators have yet been brought to court and charged. Now, isn't that quite shocking after all this time? Isn't it something that ought to worry all of us?
Yes, so absolutely. Despite the fact that child sexual exploitation is a very difficult issue because of the manner with which evidence is gathered and so on and so forth, I mean, I'm quite clear in here, not enough has been done by the police and the criminal justice system to both stop, prevent or hold perpetrators to account. The biggest thing we could do for victims, apart from running better services for them, is actually get some of their perpetrators into a courtroom and into a cell. That's the type of justice that those victims will want. So yes, that would be correct, Chairman.
Okay. And that's something, we probably need to think about the police's responsibility there, and your idea of an inspection of what they've been doing as well.
I mean, obviously, I probably spoke out of my my responsibilities, but it just, for all that Rotherham are damned in here, they had to cooperate with a pretty tough inspection, and we got every document that we asked for, and it may be that the sum total of the various investigations and things that are going on are enough. It just doesn't feel that way to me right now.
And finally, you had powers to require people to come to speak to you, but the previous leader declined, Roger Stone. Did you not have powers to make him come to see you?
Not somebody that's no longer... he resigned completely during the course of the inspection, I think. So he was... Right. He stood down as leader when we started, and he stood down completely whilst we were inspecting. He sent helpful information, which I refer to in the report, by email and via solicitors, I think, but no, he didn't want to be interviewed. And neither did Sean Wright, the previous Police Crime Commissioner, who spoke to me by phone but wasn't prepared to be properly interviewed. Okay,
well, Roger Stone has agreed to come to see this committee on March the 10th, so we'll be asking him some questions then, no doubt, as on the basis of your report and Professor Jay's report. But thank you very much indeed for coming this afternoon and being so open with the committee in your responses to our questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Okay, we have our second session now for this afternoon. Welcome. Just for the sake of our record, if you could say who you are and the capacity in which you're coming to the committee this afternoon.
My name is Miriam Rosen. I was Director Education at Ofsted from April 2004 to August 2009. I was responsible in that role to HMCI for the inspections of schools, initial teacher education, joint area reviews, and also, until 2007, learning and skills. From September 2009 to April 2010, I was Executive Director, deputising for HMCI and responsible for the outsourcing of early years inspection. I retired in April 2010. I returned in July 2011 to be interim HMCI, initially for 3 months, later extended to 6 months, covering the gap until Sir Michael Wilshaw took up his post in January 2012. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, clearly, as I haven't been employed by Ofsted for some time. I was asked to attend the committee because, as Director Education, I was the director responsible for the joint area reviews in Ofsted.
Okay. Right, you've probably not really been here this afternoon and heard the session with Louise Casey, but maybe you've read about the previous committee evidence sessions with individuals who've been in senior positions at Ofsted. You probably saw that we asked them about Professor Jay's comments when she came to see the committee, and we said, had Ofsted failed the children of Rotherham? And she said, to some extent, yes. Now, Debbie Jones said it wouldn't give us a straightforward apology. Eventually she said the word sorry, but John Goldup said he apologised straight away for Ofsted's failings in these matters. Are you going to offer an apology as well on behalf of your role in Ofsted for the failings of the inspections into children's services in Rotherham?
Well, I'm very sorry that the young people of Rotherham suffered from abuse and sexual exploitation over a long period of time. I'd like to reiterate the apology that Sir Michael Wilshaw, HMCI, gave to the Education Select Committee. He said that Ofsted didn't get it right on child sexual exploitation in Rotherham and didn't discover the extent of child sexual exploitation taking place. He ended up by saying lots of people failed these children, we were one of them, and we need to put it right. So yes, I would like to apologise.
That's in your personal capacity, obviously.
Well,
now, yes.
I have to speak personally,
yeah, of course,
because I'm not employed
okay.
by Ofsted.
Now, Debbie Jones, looking back from her current position, said, mistakes were made. Do you think mistakes were made while you were in a position of responsibility, and if so, what were they?
Well, I could talk to you about the Joint Area Review Programme. Would you like me to do that?
Well, if it helps us to understand why the inspections that Ofsted didn't highlight the issue of child sexual exploitation in a way that perhaps they should have done.
I think that's right, that the Joint Area Review Programme didn't highlight the area of child sexual exploitation. I do need to explain a bit about it, though, because it was a quite complicated system, if that's okay with you. The Joint Area Review inspections were developed over a 2-year period from 2003 to 2005. They were multi-inspectorate reviews. There were 10 inspectorates and commissions working together on these. The project was actually led by Ofsted, but all the expertise on social care was provided by CSCI, by the Commission for Social Care Inspection. I think that it was a significant achievement to get the 10 inspectorates working together to produce a joint inspection system. However, looking back at it, there were things that weren't ideal. For example, it was a very broad framework that we had covering the 5 Every Child Matters outcomes, and it was in response to the government's Every Child Matters paper. This meant that we didn't focus sufficiently, I think, on certain areas. There was some coverage on child sexual exploitation, but there wasn't the focus on it that was needed. I mean, looking back on it, I think we would have to say there was insufficient focus on it. We didn't know then what we know now about the scale and scope of child sexual exploitation. I would have to say that this is, back when we finished developing the inspections and started them in 2005, so it's quite a long time ago. We consulted widely with the sector, with local authorities and with social care, the social care sector. And we weren't, there wasn't that realisation in the sector then that child sexual exploitation was such a major problem. There is that realisation now, and I think it's come about gradually. John Golder spoke about the importance of 2012, of the court case in Rochdale, and of various reports that were published then. And we do know a great deal more about it, the articles in the Times. It has led to a much more proactive approach by Ofsted, I think. And although I'm no longer in Ofsted, I have read about the new inspection system that has been brought in very recently, and that is taking a much deeper, more investigative approach to child sexual exploitation.
So would it be fair to say that in the past then, given you're pulling all these various inspection regimes together, it became a bit of a tick box exercise which couldn't get behind into the culture and what really was happening in it?
The joint area reviews were not a tick box exercise. They were inspections, but they were looking at a very broad range of things within the local authority area, range, not just staying safe, but enjoying and achieving, and health, and things to do with economic well-being. There were lots of things being covered, and because of the time and because of the resources of the inspectors there, they couldn't be covered in a great deal of depth. Now, inspectors are going in, a large team looking at a much smaller, more focused area, so they can look at it in much more depth.
But nevertheless, do you think there's a more general point, and maybe there's been some disagreement in the evidence we've had, that when councillors who are in the end part-time, particularly if they're not a cabinet member, but they're getting a report, as they see it, about how their authority is doing, and it says adequate, it doesn't exactly set the alarm bells ringing. Should councillors be allowed to rely? Should they be able to rely on a report by an independent organisation like Ofsted and take it at face value what it says about the services in their authority?
Well, I think we would hope that they could rely on a report by Ofsted. So, I'm very sorry that some of the reports perhaps gave a false reassurance.
Okay. And then, what actually challenges Ofsted? I mean, Ofsted isn't held to account by anyone, really, is it?
Ofsted is held to account. The accountability goes through Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, and he or she produces the annual report each year, and of course appears before the Education Select Committee. And there is challenge and discussion from the Education Select Committee. So that's the line of accountability.
Okay. David?
Debbie Jones, when she was talking to us, referred to the failures being to do with the frameworks used for inspection as being the cause of why things were missed, because it was the inspection regime was based on a framework approach. Do you share that view? And if so, why did you depend so heavily on that system and clearly failed to root out this kind of unacceptable
It's part
activity?
of it. But the main problem was that at the time that we didn't have sufficient understanding about the scale and scope and nature of child sexual exploitation. Had we done so, the frameworks would have addressed it. So, it was our understanding of that. And I don't think it was just Ofsted and the other inspectorates, and especially CSCI, because they were the specialists in social care, but I also think it was the sector as a whole. I think there's been a very large moving forward in our understanding over the years, and that's come through certainly in the J report, that there have been a shift in people's understanding.
So the Children's Services Inspectorate that was merged into Ofsted, they had no awareness of this as an issue either, is that what you said?
I'm sure they had some awareness of it, but nothing like the awareness that we have at the moment. It was, if you look back at the framework for the joint area reviews, which clearly I have done because I've been thinking about this since you asked me to come along, child sexual exploitation is mentioned, but there's not a big focus on it. And if you look at the guidance for inspectors, that's about asking the children's views about it. Now, of course, that's extremely important. But if you look at the guidance that there was on child protection of young children in the home, there was very much more extensive guidance there. So we didn't have the same understanding and the same sharp focus on it.
December 2009, Ofsted made a very critical report of the Council's children's safeguarding services that made no reference to child sexual exploitation. How could that be the case?
Well, that was a new framework, which in fact I didn't have anything to do with, but of course I'm aware of it. And that framework looked particularly at the contact, referral and assessment centres, and it looked at how social workers were going about their jobs. And it was a 2-day inspection, and it picked up what was going on in those 2 days. And it clearly found that practice was poor, and said so very clearly. But because they were only there for 2 days, they may not have picked up on child sexual exploitation. It would depend what had come in through the front door during those 2 days.
Is this a viable argument that it was a mistake? It was a mistake to merge the Children's Services Inspector with Ofsted, because, for example, Louise Casey has referred to this issue of because educational attainment was improving in Rotherham at that period, that masked the failings of the Children's Services function within the local authority.
I don't think so, actually.
Louise Casey certainly believes that might be the case.
Sorry, what exactly did she say?
Louise, she believes that the fact that the educational attainment was rising, that it meant the overall Ofsted inspection result was good, but within that good report was masking the fact that children's services were inadequate.
Is she talking about the 2006 JOR report?
2010 onwards.
The 2010 one. Now, I'd actually left by the time that report was produced, but as I understand it, as I've looked back at the frameworks, there was a focus on child sexual exploitation in that report, but clearly not sufficient. So I don't think it was a question of a good performance in education masking a poor performance in child sexual exploitation and in children's social care. I would guess that what the inspectors found there and then was adequate. It wasn't so poor. And an inspection is a snapshot. You do see what you see there, and that's presumably what they found. But I think we've still got the problem that there was insufficient focus on child sexual exploitation.
Okay.
Even though there was more than earlier.
Right.
Thanks, Chairman. The children in Rotherham knew that they were being abused. Parents, taxi drivers, members of the public in Rotherham knew that children were being raped. Risky Business, an organisation working with young people in Rotherham, knew all about this child sexual exploitation that was going on. From 2005, council officers and indeed councillors in Rotherham knew about this significant, dreadful problem. Why did your Ofsted inspectors not spot this?
My reading of the 2006 report is that the inspectors did discover that there was child sexual exploitation going on. They spoke to Risky Business. They spoke to some of the children who had been helped by Risky Business. And they thought that Risky Business was actually doing a good job. And I think many people do feel Risky Business was doing a good job. I think Louise Casey said it was groundbreaking, or words to that effect. What they didn't discover was the extent of child sexual exploitation. Now, why didn't they discover that? Well, of course, they look at the authority's self-assessment. They look at documents provided by the authority. A close reading of the J report shows that there were lots of different documents produced by the authority. Some of them were clear about the extent, some of them weren't. Some of them didn't mention it. And I can only assume that the inspectors didn't manage to get hold of the right reports. And because they were looking at a wide range of things, not just this one area, perhaps they didn't dig in the way that people would do these days to get all the possible reports. But what I am convinced of is that if those inspectors had discovered just what the extent was, they would have pursued it.
Yeah.
Because, a social care inspector isn't there to not help protect children. They want to help protect children.
Okay. So they knew about child sexual exploitation back in 2006. The inspectors knew about it.
Well,
That's what you said.
they mention it. If you read the report, it talks about it and says that children were being assisted by Risky Business. So we haven't got the evidence base. This was 9 years ago.
Yeah.
But my reading of that report is that they spoke to Risky Business, they spoke to children, they concluded Risky Business was doing a good job, and they credited them with that. That contributed to the good judgment.
And then,
but they didn't know about the extent.
All right. And then in terms of how Ofsted works then, and you mentioned the report, the inspection in 2009 in response to David's question. So they spot that exploitation is taking place in 2006. They don't know the extent of it. How did your inspectors flag it up to future inspectors within Ofsted to say, just be aware that we think we're probably onto something here. Children are being exploited. When you go in and do that 2-day inspection in 2009, or any inspectors that go in between, why don't you have a look to this in a bit more detail? How did that work, Miriam?
I think between the JARS inspections and the inspections that took place in 2009, I don't know whether those inspectors would have looked at the previous inspection report.
Really, Miriam?
Sorry?
Really?
Well, I assume they did, but I don't know whether they did. Because I wasn't actually concerned with the 2009 inspection.
But surely, you've worked at a very senior level within Ofsted, and surely you would come to this committee and say a basic concept of any Ofsted inspector when going into an authority would be to look at the previous year's reports to flag up any potential aspects of what you might want to look into this step. But you've not come and said that, have you?
You're quite right that normally we do look at the previous reports.
Well, you didn't have the confidence to say that that's what would be done.
I just didn't know because it was a new system. But you're probably right. They probably did.
Well, they probably didn't. They probably
I'm
didn't.
Sorry, I don't know.
Sorry, Miriam. They probably didn't because Ofsted don't reach any further conclusions after 2006 in any major way that hundreds of girls are being raped. Do they?
Well, I think as the reports go through, some of them are inadequate and some of them are adequate, and that's a shame that we don't that we see a variation in the judgments being made. But the inspectors will have conducted the inspection and looked at what they could on the ground and drawn their conclusions appropriately.
Did the staff that you used to inspect children's services from 2007 onwards have adequate social work skills and experience that would have enabled them to be able to work beyond the limited frameworks with which they were given?
Almost all of the inspectors we had from 2007 onwards came to us from the Commission for Social Care Inspection. They transferred across. As time went by, we started recruiting new social care inspectors. A lot of them worked in senior positions in local authorities. They had training on the frameworks that they were doing. They also were being kept up to date with social care practice through the more senior social care inspectors in Ofsted.
Right. And we've heard with questions from David about the limitations of the frameworks. We've heard from other witnesses that the frameworks were inadequate. But I'm really asking about your inspectors' abilities to listen and hear from people they met. Not work within a framework, but to listen and hear, some sort of emotional intelligence when they're out there. Did they have training when did they first get training in spotting child sexual exploitation?
I think that would have been later on. I think the training that they received before they came across would have been mainly in child protection. And although child sexual exploitation would have been mentioned, a lot of the training would have been about protecting young children in the home. But I think that if these social care inspectors had come across, for example, inappropriate behaviour by social workers, and I think that's partly what you're saying, I'm sure they would have spotted that.
Did anybody ever flag up child sexual exploitation in Rotherham to you?
Not to me, no.
But to others in Ofsted?
That I don't know. I mean, if it had been discovered as a problem there that people were really concerned about, I'm sure they would have flagged it up both through the social care matrix, as it were, part of the matrix, and to me. But that inspection report didn't come up to me for special scrutiny, and the arrangement we had at the time was that I couldn't read all of the reports, but I would have read ones about which there was a concern, and that one didn't come through to me. And I think it's going back to what I said earlier, that the inspectors, although they had discovered that some was taking place, thought it was being dealt with well by risky business, and they didn't know about the scope of it, the scale of it.
Okay. Debbie Jones told us that Ofsted has sacked people where it's been proven that inspectors have got it wrong. How many inspectors have you sacked, Miriam?
Well, I think you mean my divisional managers, because I didn't directly manage the workforce, but they came up to me. I can't answer that question. I don't know exactly. We'd have to go back to Ofsted.
20? 200?
I really don't know, but what I can tell you is that I had regular one-to-ones with my divisional managers, and we always discussed staffing problems. Now, of course, if somebody was struggling, first we would go through due process. They would be offered support. They wouldn't
but
just
you must have have an idea of how many people were sacked.
Yeah, I suspect that very few were. Or none. I mean, I can't tell you exactly. I'm aware that where people were struggling, we went through due process and would offer support, but I can't. And people sometimes resign at some points when you're going through a process. But so I don't remember any being sacked. But I think you would have to ask the records, Ofsted, if it's got any records of this.
Would it not have been an idea for you to meet more frontline inspectors instead of just going through your divisional managers, Miriam?
Oh, I worked with inspectors. I did go out with inspectors. I went out frequently. I met them. But because I had quite a broad scope, what I had to do was delegate to my divisional managers, support them, hold them to account, But then also, I would read things, I would go out on inspections, I would talk to people. So I was taking a very active interest, I can assure you.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Okay. I think we actually have got some figures from Ofsted on inspectors who are being sacked as well, so we can consider those. Okay, thank you. Chris?
During your time at Ofsted, how closely did you work with other inspectorates or ombudsmen with you in local authorities?
With other inspectorates?
Yes.
Yes, very
Or ombudsmen,
closely.
for that matter.
Very closely, because I was there at the time of the joint area reviews, and the 10 inspectorates and commissions worked together to develop the joint area reviews and then to carry them out. And this was a big task because inspectorates tend to have different approaches, different methodology, and we had to try and come up with a common framework and common approach that we would use in the joint area reviews, and this we did. Most of the inspections were carried out by 5 of the 10 inspectorates, but the others were still involved. They produced briefings for the inspections that we were holding, and we also, after each joint area review, we had a cross-inspectorate challenge meeting when the inspectorates could challenge the findings. Now, all inspectorates were invited to the cross-inspectorate challenge meetings for each joint area review. They might not always turn up, but the ones which were involved always did. So there was a lot of joint working there.
Shared information amongst...
Well, we were working together. So yes, we shared information. We had briefings that came to us before each joint area review. The different inspectorates didn't have to provide a briefing, but they often did. So we could see what issues they were concerned about in the local authority.
Give us a flavour of the sort of information that you shared there?
Well, it might have been something about health, saying that they were particularly concerned about the obesity levels in this particular authority, for example.
Right, okay.
Or education, saying they were concerned about overall levels of achievement.
So you think could Ofsted inspections then include a non-Ofsted specialist to offer challenge and scrutiny?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Could Ofsted inspections include a non-Ofsted specialist to provide challenge and scrutiny then, do you think?
You mean somebody who was a lay inspector?
Well, a non-Ofsted specialist, yeah.
Well, all the joint area reviews included people from different inspectorates. They weren't all Ofsted inspectors. So from that
you think that's happening? You think that was happening then, yeah?
Well, I think the inspectors did challenge each other. That's part of the process. Okay. Although, for example, the social care inspectors would have led on making the judgments about social care, the judgments would have been confirmed at a team meeting, and then again they would have been subject to challenge at the cross-inspectorate challenge meetings. So there was a lot of joint working going on. Now, at the end of, halfway through 2009, the system did change, and we moved to the new inspections of contact, referral and assessment centres, and the joint area reviews stopped. And we didn't have the same level of joint working after that, although, of course, we went into the comprehensive area assessment for a time when we were working together with the Audit Commission. I should say, though, that another aspect of the joint area reviews is that they were going on at the same time as the Audit Commission was carrying out its corporate assessments. So we did triangulate our views with the Audit Commission. Okay. And at a different time, a slightly different time, HMI Probation were carrying out their inspections in the local authority. They carried them out in advance of the joint area reviews, but they deferred the report until we produced our report so that, again, we could do some triangulation of judgments there, see what had been found.
So I was going to say, Debbie Jones told us that Ofsted was carrying out what appeared to be integrated inspections, pilots with the Care Quality Commission, HMI Inspectorate for Constabulary and, where appropriate, prisons and probation. And from what you're saying there, it seems that, would you agree that you were doing similar joint working then during your period at Ofsted? From what you just said, it seems that you were. Would that be fair?
We were doing, well, I think what she was referring to was looking at something quite narrow, such as, for example, child protection, and having a lot of different inspectorates looking at it. Is that correct?
Yes.
I mean, I'm out of date as far
Right.
as Ofsted goes, because I
Okay.
haven't been there for 3 years.
Right. So what was the joint working then when you were there then? I mean, how did that work out?
What was the joint working?
Yeah, because you kind of
to-
referred to it, but I mean,
we were working
Debbie
together.
Jones told us that they were carrying out what appeared to be integrated inspection pilots. Are you saying that your joint working was a bit different to that? It was a bit more widespread, it wasn't narrowly focused?
I can't really speak for what happened after I left in January 2012.
But during your period though?
Yes, I can. Well, I've just told you what was
Yeah,
happening then.
yeah.
We were working together as 10 inspectorates and commissions, carrying out the joint area reviews.
Right, but that's different though, you think, to what was
We were-
happening under Debbie Jones?
I don't actually know exactly
Okay.
what's being carried out at the moment, but I think they're looking at aspects such as safeguarding with a lot of inspectorates together, whereas we were actually looking at a broader framework.
Okay.
But still, there was, as I say, there was extensive joint working between the inspectorates in the period that I was in Ofsted.
So there was no silo problems then, in your opinion?
We found that we were doing things differently, but a lot of that was we tried to work through it in the development process so that we could come up with an agreed approach. We also, at the end of the first year of joint area reviews, the inspectorates evaluated the process and the product and made changes to try and improve it. So, because I think when you have a very big project like that, 10 inspectorates working together, very difficult to get it absolutely right straight away. So at the end of a year, we thought about what we needed to improve, and we did change it slightly.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff.
So, if the joint area reviews were so useful, why did they stop?
I think that they were too broad, really. I think that was one of the problems with them. They gave an overall picture of the authority.
That they could miss serious problems.
Yes, but if you're wanting to get under the skin of something, there is an advantage to having a narrower focus.
Mark.
Miriam, in your remarks earlier, you said a couple of things. I think you're referring to the period up to about 2007, but you said that we didn't know then what we know now about the extent of child sexual exploitation, and you also said that there wasn't sufficient understanding about the scale, scope and nature of child sexual exploitation. Were you talking about Rotherham, or were you talking about the country as a whole?
Well, I think I'm talking about Rotherham in particular, but I'm not just talking about Rotherham, because if you think about some of the reports that have come through to us, the Rochdale trial, it was clearly going on in other places. The Times articles were mainly about Rotherham, but then we had the Rochdale trials. We also had the all-party report on children missing from care, and I think that wasn't just confined to one area.
Really what I'm driving at is what we now know was going on in Rotherham exceptional, or is it your concern that there could be many other Rotherhams across the country?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that one. We have a greater understanding of the scale of
Right.
child sexual
Can I just ask you,
exploitation now.
what was it that allowed it to happen in Rochdale then, in your view, and in the view of your reporting?
Well, I suppose what I'm saying is that when we went in 2006, we didn't discover the scale of it. We now know that there is more widespread child sexual exploitation than we knew about then. And we know to look for it. So inspectors going into different local authorities now are actively looking for
All right,
it.
and therefore if inspectors are actively looking for it, are you confident that the fact that cases other than Rotherham and Rochdale haven't come forward means that there aren't any others?
I really don't know. I can't answer that.
All right, okay, thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for coming this afternoon and giving evidence to us. It's appreciated. Thank you.